The central train station was a sea of moving bodies, a frantic rush of departures and arrivals. In the corner, near the ticket kiosks, a man suddenly collapsed. A small crowd formed, and security guards quickly rushed in, creating a human barrier. Lila, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, stepped forward, her eyes locked on the fallen man's pale face. "I can help," she said softly. One guard didn't even look up. "Back off, miss. You don't need to be here. Let the professionals handle this." Lila paused, then took another step. Because sometimes belonging isn't about permission. It is simply about life itself. The air in the station was thick with the scent of coffee, damp umbrellas, and the metallic tang of the tracks. It was the height of the evening rush hour, a time when everyone is a stranger to everyone else. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast long, distorted shadows on the platform, humming with a frequency that most people didn't notice. Lila closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound ground her. She could feel the vibrations of the heavy trains through the soles of her shoes, a mechanical pulse that felt distant compared to the frantic, irregular beat of her own tired heart. Lila sat on a wooden bench, her back aching from a 12-hour shift at the city hospital. The weariness was a physical weight, pressing against her shoulders and making her eyelids heavy. She looked like just another commuter, tired, quiet, and deeply focused on her lukewarm tea. Her scrubs were hidden beneath a heavy coat, and her stethoscope was tucked away at the bottom of her bag, a silent reminder of the lives she had touched that day. To the world, she was just a young woman waiting for the 6:15 train to the suburbs. Lila was used to being undervalued. In the medical hierarchy, nurses are the silent glue that holds everything together. But in the chaos of a public space, they are invisible. People see the uniform, not the person. And without the uniform, Lila was just a face in the crowd, someone easily dismissed by those in a hurry. She watched the people around her, the businessmen on their phones, the students with heavy backpacks, and the elderly couples clutching each other's arms. She had a habit of observing the way people moved, the way they breathed, and the way they held their tension in their jaws. It was an instinct she couldn't turn off, even when she was off the clock and desperate for rest. Near the kiosks, a middle-aged man was struggling with his luggage. Lila noticed the way he was wiping sweat from his forehead, even though the station was cool. She saw the slight tremor in his hands and the way he leaned heavily against the machine. Most people would assume he was just stressed about his ticket or perhaps running late. But Lila felt that familiar prickle of concern at the base of her neck. She watched him for an extra 10 seconds, her nurse brain already running through a list of possibilities. Then he swayed. His suitcase hit the floor with a heavy thud, and he slumped against the metal kiosk before sliding to the ground like a marionette with cut strings. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. The rush of the station didn't stop, but it swirled around the fallen man like a whirlpool. A few people stopped and gasped, their faces mirroring a mix of curiosity and fear. Two security guards, young and clearly stressed by the sudden responsibility, pushed through the crowd. They began shouting for people to move back, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. They were doing their job, trying to maintain order, but they were also clearly out of their depth, their eyes darting around for a supervisor who wasn't there. Lila stood up. Her instinct to help was a physical force, pulling her toward the center of the circle. She moved with a calm, practiced pace. She didn't run. Running creates panic. She moved with intent and a quiet authority that she didn't even know she possessed outside the hospital walls. "Move back! Give him space!" one guard yelled, his voice cracking. He was trying to roll the man over, his movements jerky and panicked, potentially risking a spinal injury. Lila reached the edge of the circle. "I can help," she said, her voice a low, steady frequency designed to cut through the noise of the crowd. The other guard, a man with a tired face and a badge that looked too large for him, put a hand up to stop her. "Back off, miss. We've called the paramedics. You don't need to be here. Stay behind the line." He didn't see the nurse. He saw a girl in a hoodie who looked too young to know anything useful. He saw someone who didn't belong in the crisis, just another bystander getting in the way of the protocol. Lila didn't argue. She didn't shout her credentials or demand to be seen. She simply stood her ground, a few feet away, her eyes never leaving the man on the floor. She saw his chest wasn't rising the way it should. She saw the guards trying to move him too quickly, their lack of training visible in every fumbled touch. She saw the way his eyes were half open, clouded with a confusion that wasn't just a simple faint. She knew that every second wasted was a second he couldn't afford. The internal conflict was sharp. Part of her wanted to just walk away, to get on her train and go home to the safety of her apartment. She was exhausted. She had given everything she had to her patients all day. Why should she fight for the right to work for free in a cold train station? But then she looked at the man's hand. It was clenched, his knuckles white, as if he were holding on to a life that was slowly slipping away. She stayed. She stood there, an outlier in the crowd. She wasn't part of the professional team, and she wasn't part of the curious crowd. She was something else, a silent witness waiting for the moment when the silence of the man on the ground would become too dangerous to maintain. She knew that in a few minutes the guards would realize they didn't know what to do next, and she would be there when the reality of the situation finally broke through their pride. The seconds felt like hours. The man on the floor began to breathe in a way that sounded like a dry rattle, a sound that sent a shiver through the crowd. One of the guards was on his radio, his voice rising in pitch as he tried to explain the location to a dispatcher who seemed to be asking too many questions. The other guard was trying to prop the man's head up with a rolled-up jacket, thinking he was helping him breathe. Lila's eyes narrowed. She knew that in this position, the man's airway was being compromised, the tongue falling back against the throat. The crowd was getting restless. Someone was filming with a phone, the lens reflecting the harsh overhead lights. Someone else was trying to offer water, not realizing the man couldn't swallow and might choke. It was a classic scene of public chaos, well-meaning people doing the wrong things because they were afraid of the silence and felt the need to act, no matter how incorrectly. Lila felt the pressure of the moment. She knew that if she stepped in, she was taking full responsibility. She was no longer just a witness. She was the one in charge of a life. And in a public space, without a team, equipment, or the protection of a hospital's legal department, that is a terrifying place to be. But she also saw the man's face turning a shade of dusky blue. She looked for the cold sweat, the trembling, and the specific glazed look that accompanied a sudden drop in glucose or a neurological event. The guard looked at her, then back at the man, his defensive posture finally breaking as he saw the man's lips turn a darker shade. He realized then that he wasn't looking at a meddler, but a potential savior. "Stop," Lila said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the clinical edge. The tone of someone who has spent years in the ER, commanding rooms full of chaos. The guard with the jacket looked up, annoyed and defensive. "Look, I told you. I'm a nurse," she said, her voice cutting him off before he could finish. "And if you keep his head at that angle, he's going to stop breathing entirely. Let's pause for a second. Just 1 second. Look at his lips." The guard hesitated, the authority in her voice finally registering. He saw the way she was looking at the patient, not with panic, but with a cold, analytical focus. He saw that she wasn't looking at the crowd or the cameras. She was looking at the man's throat, watching the struggle for air. "Lay him flat," Lila commanded, her voice softening but gaining a new level of authority. "And move the jacket under his shoulders, not his head. We need to open the airway now. Please." The guard didn't know why he was listening to her, but he complied. He felt the shift in power. The girl in the hoodie had vanished, replaced by a professional who knew exactly what the next move should be. The crowd sensed the shift too. The whispering died down as Lila knelt on the cold floor. Lila knelt down beside the man. She didn't take over with a loud flourish. She simply placed her hands on his chest, feeling for the rhythm of his heart. She checked his pulse. It was thready and fast, a desperate drumbeat. She looked at his pupils, checking for a reaction to the light. She was doing a full assessment in the middle of a train station, using nothing but her senses and her years of training. "What's happening to him?" someone in the crowd asked. Their voice hushed. "He's having a severe respiratory episode," Lila said, not looking up. She spoke to the guards, not the crowd, giving them clear, actionable tasks. "We need to keep him stable until the paramedics arrive. Has anyone found his ID? Does he have an inhaler or a medical bracelet? Check his bag." The guards began to search his pockets and his suitcase, finally having a task to focus on. They were no longer the authority struggling with a problem they didn't understand. They were her assistants. The tension in the circle began to settle into a focused, quiet energy. Lila was the anchor, her calm presence acting as a stabilizer for everyone around her. She noticed the man's breathing was still shallow. His skin felt clammy and cold. She didn't panic. She didn't start shouting for a defibrillator that wasn't there. She simply held his hand, grounding him. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a calm frequency in the chaos. "Focus on my voice. Breathe in and out. You're not alone." The guards found a small card in his wallet, tucked behind a picture of a little girl. Diabetic. Lila's mind shifted gears instantly. It wasn't just a respiratory issue. It was likely a severe hypoglycemic shock, the body's systems failing as the brain ran out of fuel. She checked his breath. It didn't have the fruity smell of ketoacidosis. This confirmed her suspicion. "We need sugar," Lila said to the guard on the radio. "Not water, sugar. A packet of honey, a sugary soda, or even a piece of candy. Now, go!" The guard didn't question her for a second. He turned and ran toward a nearby cafe. Lila stayed on the floor, her knees pressing into the cold, grimy station tile. She was no longer Lila the commuter. She was the outlier who had stepped in when everyone else was standing back. She realized that the guard's earlier comment, "You don't need to be here," was the most wrong thing she had ever heard in her life. Because in this station, in this moment, she was the only one who truly needed to be right where she was. The guard returned with a small cup of orange juice, his face flushed from the sprint. Lila carefully administered a few drops at a time, making sure he didn't choke. She moved with a deliberate slowness that frustrated the curious onlookers, but was essential for the man's safety. She was managing the situation with the precision of an ICU unit, but with the heart of a person who simply didn't want a stranger to die on a Tuesday afternoon. She could feel the man's pulse beginning to steady, a faint but sure sign of recovery. The paramedics finally arrived, the sound of their heavy equipment cases clicking open, echoing through the vast station. They pushed through the crowd, their bright uniforms a beacon of official help. They saw a young woman on the floor, holding the man's hand, her face calm and focused amidst the lingering chaos. The station seemed to regain its breath as the man was lifted onto a gurney. Lila felt the cool evening air finally penetrate the heat of the intense moment. The paramedics worked with a silent efficiency, their movements a choreographed dance she had performed 1,000 times herself. It was a familiar ritual of rescue, one that didn't need the sterile walls of a hospital to be valid or powerful. "What have we got?" the lead paramedic asked, kneeling down and looking at Lila with professional interest. Lila gave the report, the clinical details, the exact timing of the collapse, the diabetic discovery, and the man's positive response to the glucose. She spoke the language of the professionals, concise and accurate. She didn't need to explain who she was or why she was there. Her words told the story of her competence. The paramedic nodded, his eyes showing a flash of respect that transcended the situation. "Got it. Excellent work. We'll take it from here." As they loaded the man onto the stretcher, the guards stood back, their faces a mix of relief and realization. They looked at each other, then at Lila, the girl they had tried to push away. The man was awake now, his eyes focusing on Lila for a brief second before the paramedics moved him toward the waiting ambulance. He didn't say anything. He didn't have the strength, but he gave her a small, weak squeeze of the hand that meant more than any metal ever could. Lila stood up, brushing the dust and grime from her jeans. She felt the weight of the station returning to her. The noise, the rush, the cold air, and the smell of grease. The circle began to break. The event was over, and the crowd began to melt back into the shadows of the evening commute. One of the guards walked over to her. He looked embarrassed, his earlier bravado completely gone. I'm sorry about earlier. I thought you were just another bystander trying to get a look for social media. I didn't realize." Lila gave him a small, tired smile. "It's okay. You were trying to protect the scene. But sometimes the best protection is a pair of hands that knows what to do. Next time, just look at the eyes before you look at the clothes." "Are you a doctor?" a woman from the crowd asked, her phone still in her hand, though the camera was now pointed at the floor. "I'm a nurse," Lila said, and for the first time that day, she felt a surge of pride in the title. The woman didn't look shocked, but she looked thoughtful, as if she were seeing Lila for the first time. "I thought you didn't belong here. I mean, you didn't look like, well, you look like one of us, just a regular person." "That's because I am," Lila said softly. "I'm just someone who happened to be here when things went wrong." The soft twist of this story isn't that Lila performed a miracle. The twist is that she didn't want to be a hero. She didn't step in to prove she was better than the guards or to show off her extensive skills. She stepped in because she saw a small wrong, a misplaced jacket, an obstructed airway that she couldn't ignore. She stepped in because the silence of the man on the floor was more important than the noise of the guard's pride or her own exhaustion. She realized that belonging in a crisis isn't about having a badge or a special uniform. It's about having the courage to see the truth when everyone else is looking at the distraction. Lila didn't dominate the scene. She guided it. She didn't take over, she supported. She proved that empathy is the most effective tool in any medical kit. As she walked toward her train, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had spent all day in a high-tech hospital where everyone knew she belonged and respected her authority. But it was here, in a grimy train station, where she was told she didn't belong, that she felt the most useful. She had proven that a nurse is a nurse everywhere, even when she's just a girl in a hoodie waiting for the 6:15. She sat down on her train, the car filled with people who had no idea what she had just done 10 minutes ago. She looked at her hands. They were steady now, the adrenaline finally fading into a deep, restful calm. She opened her book and began to read, the words flowing easier than before. She was Lila again, the commuter. But she knew that if the silence ever returned, she would be ready to break it again without hesitation. Because the difference between a tragedy and a recovery isn't always a famous surgeon or a state-of-the-art hospital. Sometimes it's just one person who refuses to stay behind the yellow line. Sometimes it's just the outlier who chooses to act when everyone else is waiting for permission from someone in a uniform. The train moved out of the station, the city lights blurring into long, glowing streaks against the window. Lila watched her reflection in the glass. She felt the exhaustion returning, but it was a different kind of tired now. A good tired. Later that week, the guard found himself checking the pulse of every situation he encountered, his eyes more open than they had ever been. He didn't just walk past people anymore. He watched the rhythms of the crowd, looking for the outliers. He had learned that heroism doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it wears an oversized hoodie and carries a lukewarm tea. The story didn't end at the station. One of the security guards, the one who had tried to block her, went home that night and told his wife about the girl in the hoodie. He told her how he had almost made a mistake and how a quiet voice had stopped him. He told her how he had learned that authority isn't always the person with the loudest voice. "I thought she didn't belong there," he said, shaking his head. "I thought she was just getting in the way. But she was the only one who actually knew what to do." The woman who had filmed the event on her phone didn't post the video for clout. Instead, she watched it several times, focusing on the way Lila had held the man's hand. She noticed the calmness in Lila's posture. She decided to delete the video, and instead, she signed up for a basic first aid class the next morning. She realized that she didn't want to be the person with the phone next time. She wanted to be the person with the hands. This is the real ripple effect of Lila's action. It wasn't about the man she saved. It was about the people she woke up. She had shown them that a crisis isn't something you just watch. It's something you participate in. Maya, Lila, arrived at her apartment, the silence of her home finally wrapping around her. She made herself a fresh cup of tea and sat by the window. She thought about the man from the station. She hoped he was in a hospital bed now, receiving the care he needed, his family on their way to see him. She didn't need a thank you note or a mention in the news. The look in the man's eyes for that one brief second was enough. It was the only credit she needed. The next day at the hospital, Lila went about her rounds as usual. She was back in the hierarchy, back in the uniform. But she carried a new sense of confidence. She realized that she didn't need the hospital walls to be effective. She didn't need the validation of a senior doctor to know her value. She saw a new intern struggling with a difficult patient. In the past, she might have waited for him to ask for help. But today, she simply stepped in. "Let's pause for a second," she said, her voice the same steady frequency she had used at the train station. The intern looked up, relieved. Lila guided him through the procedure, her hands steady, her eyes calm. She was no longer just Lila the nurse. She was the outlier who knew that her place was wherever she was needed. As she walked through the ward, she realized that the world is full of lines and boundaries. We spend so much of our lives trying to stay behind them, trying to belong in the boxes we are given. But the most important moments of our lives happen when we have the courage to cross those lines. Lila didn't just help a man in a train station. She proved that the most viral thing you can do is to be present. She proved that the most powerful thing you can bring to a room isn't your status, it's your willingness to help. The story of the girl in the hoodie is a reminder for all of us. We are all nodes in a vast interconnected network, and our willingness to act is what keeps the system from breaking. The true power of the outlier isn't just in the act itself, but in the ripple of courage it leaves behind for others to follow. Every time we cross a line to help, we make the world a little bit safer for everyone. We live in a society that is obsessed with experts and authorities. We wait for the right person to arrive before we take action. We look for the uniform, the badge, or the degree before we trust someone. And in doing so, we often miss the most valuable people in the room. Lila's superpower wasn't her medical knowledge. It was her refusal to be a bystander. It was her ability to see the small wrong and decide that it was her business to fix it. How many times have you stood at the edge of a circle thinking, "I should do something," but then stayed silent because you didn't want to be that person? How many times have you been told you didn't belong in a situation and you believed it? Belonging isn't a gift given to you by others. It's a choice you make for yourself. You belong wherever there is a need that you can fill. You belong wherever your hands can make a difference. Most people aren't uncaring. They are just afraid of the responsibility. They are afraid of being wrong. They are afraid of being the outlier. But as Lila showed us, being the outlier is the only way to change the outcome. Impact doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be heroic. Sometimes it's just a calm voice saying, "Let's pause." Sometimes it's just a pair of hands that knows how to open an airway. The man from the train station is back home now, living his life because one woman decided to ignore the guard's warning. He doesn't know her name. He doesn't know where she works, but he knows that when he was lost in the dark, a silent hand reached out and brought him back. As you go through your day-to-day, try to be Lila. Try to look at the crowd and see the person. Try to look at the crisis and see the solution. Don't wait for permission to be kind. Don't wait for a uniform to be useful. The world is waiting for someone to step up. The world is waiting for someone to break the circle. One move, total silence, and a heart that finally chose to act. What line will you cross today? What circle will you break? The train station is still there, full of people rushing toward their own destinations. But Lila knows that the destination isn't the point. The point is what you do while you're waiting. Lila's song is still humming in the air. The song of the outlier who knew exactly where she belonged. What will you notice today? Who will you decide to help? The world is louder than ever, but the silence is still there, waiting for you to listen. Will you be the one to hear it?